If I was asked to show where Africa should go as a continent through a handful of people, the first person I would introduce is Mr. Aliko Dangote, the wealthiest African and black man on the planet. He went from losing his father at age 8, being raised by his grandfather, selling sweets in primary school, starting his major business as a 20-year-old with a $3,000 loan, and being a trader, to becoming the single most influential businessman on the African continent. Today we start the inaugural episode of the Project Africa Leadership Series with the man, the myth, the legend. Aliko Dangote's current net worth is about $32.6 billion. If his entire net worth was the market capitalization of a company, he would have more value than any bank on the African continent. His most recently completed flagship project is the Dangote refinery in Lekki, Lagos State in Nigeria, and can refine 650,000 barrels of oil per day. It is the largest single train refinery in the world and cost $20 billion to build. His main company, Dangote Group, which is deep into producing things such as cement, fertilizer, sugar, salt, and flour, is one of the largest employers on the African continent with over 30,000 employees and the largest taxpayer in Nigeria. He was born on 10 April in 1957. His great-grandfather, Alhaji Alhassan Dantata, was the richest man in West Africa for some time. Following the death of his father, he went to be raised by his grandfather. His upbringing, with a family that was deep into business, had an influence on him since his early days. He went to university at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt, to study for a bachelor's degree in business management and administration, graduating at age 20 in 1977. After graduating, he went back to Lagos and got a loan from his uncle, Mr. Sanusi Abdul Kadir Dantata, to begin trading. The terms were simple. 3 trucks, 50,000 naira, or about $3,000, and the loan is to be paid back in 3 years. He was into trading, mainly importing rice from Thailand and sugar from Brazil, and supplying his goods largely to markets in northern Nigeria, where he originally is from. He also imported and sold cement, flour, and vegetable oil. This enterprise was so good for him, there are days where he would average a net profit of $10,000. Surely enough, he was able to pay back the loan on time. In the early 80s, his operations got so big, he formalized them into Dangote Group in May 1981. There he made a strategic move, leaving his hometown of Kano, relocating to Lagos, where he is mainly based up to this day. For the next decade and a half, his corporation would grow mightily to have a massive impact nationally in commodity logistics and also distribution of products. At a time that his country was rocked by instability with several military coups and a crashing in global oil prices, which caused the Nigerian economy to go from $164 billion in 1981 to $44 billion in 1989, and many people to go out of business and see their wealth bases erode as a result. He steadily grew his wealth by focusing on trading the kind of goods that would always remain in demand when an economy falls, food being a major one. At this point, he made a pivot from high profit margin sales to high volume and low profit sales with a simple idea. If you sell enough of a product at a lower price than your competitors, you can gain a lot of market share. And his plan worked so well because his competition did not have the scale that he had. To support these operations to sell at large volumes of goods across the country at a lower profit margin, he built a strong logistics network to remove any reliance on Nigerian freight networks, mostly the trains. Shipping by train would seem cheaper in theory, but would prove to be highly unreliable at a time where the government could not maintain their railway stock due to the liquidity crunch, which came as a result of the falling oil prices. With the mighty fleet of trucks, he was able to guarantee delivery times for products and reliably ship his goods deep into the Nigerian market from seaports where imported goods from Thailand and Brazil would arrive. Such a decision to build his own fulfilling capabilities would serve to be a genius move when he eventually pivoted into the world of manufacturing. While his business was doing very well, a corporate trip he made to Brazil in the 1990s would change the destiny of Dangote Group and the nation of Nigeria. In Brazil, he went and toured a massive factory. He was astonished by the sheer scale of the operation, employing 4,600 people at the time, because he considered how many livelihoods would be supported just from one factory. Through the multiplier effect, the earnings of the employees at the factory would drive spending in the communities they lived in, allowing industries like real estate, agriculture, retail, and education to thrive, just because of the spending power of the workers from one side. Seeing the transformative impact of manufacturing from its ability to create economic opportunities for more people as opposed to trading made him develop an appetite for the sector. At the time he was in Brazil, the country was battling economic turmoil, dealing with hyperinflation and a currency which he said was devaluing by the minute. This was so true that by 1994, hyperinflation reached a staggering 2000% that shopkeepers would spend a lot of their time at work adjusting prices throughout the day. And when people would earn wages, they would spend the money that day because the prices of things could even change while you're still waiting in line to pay for goods at major stores. Nevertheless, he observed how manufacturing remained as a pretty resilient industry through tough times. On the back of this transformational visit, he had a quote. I was shocked when I visited Brazil in 1997 and discovered that another third world country similar to Nigeria had huge manufacturing complexes that provided jobs for its citizens and developed its economy. If they could do it in Brazil, I recognized that we could replicate it in Nigeria. Brazil had worse issues than us in Nigeria macroeconomically. He began to question the common narrative that Nigeria couldn't industrialize due to its political and monetary instabilities. With that being said, he took action, and a few years later, he would go on to buy the Benue Cement Company, making the beginning of a new era in his business career. In 1999, Nigeria returned to civilian rule under the leadership of President Olusegun Obasanjo, a person who we will talk about in the leadership series. He brought in major economic reforms to bring growth to the local industry, encouraging manufacturing at home and reducing imports. He also encouraged privatization throughout the economy. Mr. Dangote couldn't have learned about the benefits of pivoting to manufacturing at a better time because the stability which came under the new administration would prove to be a fantastic time to grow his sprawling enterprise. In 1999, he established Dangote flour mills, and 2 years after that, he opened the first flour mill in Apapa, Lagos, with a capacity to process 500 metric tons per day. That's enough flour to make close to 900,000 loaves of bread. He also grew his flour mill operation, establishing more plants in Ikorodu, Ilorin, Kano, and Calabar. The company would go on to process 7,000 metric tons of flour a day by 2016, and at its peak in the 2010s be the second largest producer of flour in Nigeria. Dangote then sold a controlling stake of 63% in the flour mills to Tiger Brands from South Africa in 2012 for $182 million, making him a tidy profit, but proving to be a bad decision for the new owners. At that time, his other enterprise, Dangote Spaghetti, would hold a 40% market share in Nigeria. Tiger Brands would go on to struggle to manage the company well, considering the dynamics of doing business in Nigeria compared to South Africa and their lack of experience in the market. So you then buy back the company, improve operations, and sell it again in 2019 to Olam International at an even better price of $310 million. The markets did not understand why he sold a well-performing enterprise, and Dangote refuted that his enterprises are built on the sole premise of creating value, and turning imported wheat into flour simply did not make enough jobs for the Nigerian market to justify a sustained presence in the industry. Most of the jobs are made at the farms, and the farms are not in Nigeria at the moment. Going back to 2001, he also established a sugar refinery plant. Considering his long-time successful career in trading sugar since the late 70s, it was just bound to happen. His inaugural plant, also in Apapa, produced 600,000 metric tons of sugar a year. He was off to a roaring start that within a few years, he would go on to supply 70% of the market and grow the plant to produce 1.44 million metric tons a year, making it the largest in Africa and the third largest in the world. By the time the company went public, they had $450 million in sales annually. However, the largest bet he made at the dawn of civilian rule was entering the cement industry. Usually, when large enterprises acquire companies, they make a few improvements here and there without committing too much capital, because they see the acquisition as an investment in the same way one would see buying stocks or bonds. The focus is just on receiving profits. Mr. Dangote had better ideas. Instead of just fixing existing facilities, build new ones. This would mean the acquisition of Benue Cement Company gave him more than just existing factories, but a launch pad to start new ones. They already had property which had over 600 million tons of limestone reserves, which is essential for making cement. Such a strategy would prove brilliant because Nigeria was heavily dependent on imported cement, and with a fast-growing economy which would eclipse $500 billion in the 16-year span of the rule of President Obasanjo, his predecessor, President Yar'Adua, and President Goodluck Evans Jonathan, who took over after he died in office, the demand for new real estate would support a surge in the downstream industries that would allow construction to happen, cement production being a major one. Furthermore, the cost of imported and locally produced cement was quite high. So in the words of Jeff Bezos, your margin is my opportunity. He found his opportunity to bet big in Africa's fastest growing construction industry. At the time he acquired Benue Cement Company, they only produced 900,000 metric tons per year. which was a modest amount. So in 2003, he made the bold move to buy Obajana cement, which didn't produce any cement at the time, but also sat on substantial limestone reserves. He would then invest 120 billion naira, or roughly $1 billion, to build Obajana cement plant, which would then open in 2007 with the capacity of 5 million tons per annum. Not too long after opening, he would invest into a $3 billion complex to expand the same Obajana cement plant and his other operations. Consider this, they were already among the largest producers of cement in the continent, but he knew at the time that it was not enough to supply the future demand for the country. He proved to be absolutely correct. The Obajana cement plant grew to a production capacity of an astonishing 10.25 million tons by 2012. He would also go on to open Ibese cement plant in Ogun State with a commissioned capacity of 6 million tons by 2012, though their capacity would double to 12 million tons by late 2014. As for the flagship cement plant, he opened a third line which added 3 million tons of production capacity, and a fourth line which was completed in 2020 that added another 3 million tons of production. Today it stands as the largest plant in Africa and one of the largest in the world. He was able to do so well in the cement production industry because of his deep wealth of industrial knowledge and relationships he built as a key supplier of cement to the Nigerian market decades beforehand. And remember his logistics network? It made it much easier for him to distribute his products well into the market. In fact, just today, the plant of Obajana plant alone has a fleet of about 2,400 trucks supporting their operations. Mr. Dangote would then go on to take his learnings on how to build manufacturing facilities to then scale across the continent. He already had the institutional knowledge, the talent to build and manage such facilities, and a strong relationship with creditors for capital. So he used that knowledge to expand into Senegal and Delma, South Africa in 2012, Tanzania in 2014, Ethiopia, Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Ghana, Angola and Zambia in 2015, and Cote d'Ivoire in 2021, or Ivory Coast, that is. Usually, this is where the story would end for people with successful business careers. You've made an impact in your nation, and you already are leading the continent in certain industries, so you can just call it a day. Sit down and relax. But not for Mr. Dangote. Mr. Dangote is an industrialist and a titan, meaning he will not rest until Africa is industrialized. Owing to this way of thinking, he would go on to successfully venture into the salt, rice farming, packaging, and fertilizer industries, among others. But the venture that is truly changing Africa is the Dangote refinery. For the longest time, and even up to today, Africa has had a major challenge. We export a bulk of the world's raw materials, and we import them again as processed items at a much higher markup than the prices at which we sold those minerals. In the case of crude oil, Nigeria exports tens of billions of dollars worth crude oil, and also imports billions of dollars worth oil products, mainly diesel, petrol, and jet fuel. To end this contradiction in Africa's largest oil-producing country, Mr. Aliko Dangote announced the construction of the Dangote refinery. In 2013, when he made the announcement, it seemed like one of those announcements an eccentric billionaire would make, a claim to want to do something big and different, and it ends just as that. Of course, this would gain applause, but for him, the announcement marked the launch of a project spanning a decade. It came on the back of a strong research in the prior years and disciplined process of organizing the building blocks towards making this giant initiative a success. A lot of people did not believe that he would be able to accomplish this, including some of the major politicians in Nigeria. Nevertheless, he persisted. The plan was simple. Acquire a plot of land, get the experts to build the plant, raise $6.3 billion in loans, in addition to $3 billion of his own funds as capital to build the facility, construct it within 3 years, and after that, you'll be able to produce 400,000 barrels a day in this new sprawling facility. Considering how big a refinery can get, this was not a massive operation in the eyes of the industry's largest refineries. Though at the same time, it was not a small-scale facility either. The scale could justify completion within a short time frame, or so he and his team thought. When he actually broke ground to begin building up to the point that they finished, he would then go on to understand why the politicians thought completing such a plant was impossible. The first challenge he experienced was with that first stage, acquiring the land to build the facility. He initially intended to build in Olokola in Ogun State, but conflicts with the government of the state made it hard for him to break ground. They were not giving him access to the land so that they could begin the preliminary work to build the facility. And the disagreements would go on for 3 years. He was frustrated by this because he had already taken out the loans, meaning he had to pay the interest, whether or not the money was actually going to build anything. Think about that. For 3 years, they paid $500 million in interest on a $2.65 billion loan to build a plant they did not build because the government had issues with him. He made a move to pivot to the free trade zone in Lekki, and construction would only begin in July 2017, 4 years behind schedule, and a year from the date when the Olokola facility should have been opened. Now, the change in locations did mean they were now dealing with a more friendly government, but the land itself was not fit for such an operation to happen. The land was very swampy, so they had to reclaim 2,635 hectares of land from the sea. After that was done, there was another issue. The transport infrastructure of Lagos and Nigeria as a whole was not built to move components of heavy industry. Shipping via existing ports and driving through the roads by truck from there to the refinery would prove to be unsustainable. So they had to build their own private port to take the shipment of equipment directly into their refinery complex. After this early challenge, they began to make progress. But as they moved forward, he saw how the manufacturing supply chain in Nigeria did not have the scale or the capacity to effectively supply its operations. And this was to be expected because Nigerian industry was not built with an expectation that a giant facility producing billions of liters of crude oil products was on the way. So there wasn't enough power generation and other crucial raw materials locally to supply the construction and commencement of his operations. His solution? He built off-grid power capacity, concrete batching plants, stone crushing facilities, and bought more of his own trucks to keep the operation functional. Though major challenges would persist until 2019, including financial and logistical pressures, they would do well in other areas, going on to effectively address engineering challenges triumphantly. So a 2020 launch, 4 years after the initially proposed finish time of the plant, would have been in sight until the COVID-19 pandemic rocked the world. Remember, the worst thing about the pandemic was not just the people who had to be at home or under quarantine laws that stood to curb the spread of the virus, but the factories that were closed because people were not at work. This meant that even if they were ready to continue and finish production, the suppliers were not able to provide the components because they were either closed or slowly opening. From 2020, they continued to build, albeit at a slower pace. And remember, just because you're building slowly, it does not mean that debt does not have to be paid. The constant bleeding of cash to interest payments mean that in mid-2022, he had to take out a loan of 187 billion naira just to inch the plant towards the end of its construction. As I was writing this, I began to think about the compounding of the losses in building this plant. Now that we have a bigger picture, let us revisit all the losses in this project. Firstly, from 2013, there were the interest payment losses as a result of delayed construction on capital that was not being utilized. Secondly, because they delayed starting to build and finishing, they lost on potential revenue they should have made had they finished earlier. This is 4 years of revenue that the refinery lost to delays. The third one, which is the biggest loss, can be explained like so. Had they completed the refinery quicker, they could have finished it before the pandemic began. I can argue that the pandemic-induced losses which resulted in more delays, higher prices, and high-interest emergency loans was the most impactful hurdle to the project. With that being said, he managed to open the refinery in May 2023 with an impressive capacity of 650,000 barrels per day, making it the largest facility in Africa and the largest single-train refinery in the world. This came with the painful increase in the actual cost of the facility from $9 billion in 2013 to $20 billion by the time they started operations. Remember the politicians that thought the plant would not finish construction? They went nowhere. And so the challenges some of them posed remained. The refinery would have issues with the government, such as claims of not producing industry-grade fuel because it had too much sulfur, or marketers demanding for Dangote to sell his fuel to them at a substantial discount, or the Nigerian National Petroleum Company and international oil companies, the major producers of oil in Nigeria, refusing to sell crude oil to him that he could refine, and importantly, the government continuing to issue licenses to importers of fuel, despite there being enough supply in the refinery, according to Dangote, to satisfy the demands in the Nigerian market. Some of the court cases are still going on to this day. Nevertheless, since this facility has started production, it has gone on from being a cash hemorrhaging project to the most relevant industrialization project in Africa in the 2020s. They are operating at capacity and are already organizing to increase the production to 700,000 barrels soon, and in the long term, 1.4 million barrels of oil being processed per day. Additionally, Mr. Aliko Dangote's company has gone on to take advantage of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, which has hurt the flow of oil around the world, to maximize on their production of jet fuel, making an African industrialist today to be the largest exporter of jet fuel in the world. Furthermore, the refinery has played a major part in making the 2023 removal of the fuel subsidy in Nigeria effective, not just in reducing government spending on the subsidy, but the loss of foreign currency to energy imports. Had there not been a Dangote refinery today, the gutting of the fuel subsidy would have dealt even more substantial damage to the Nigerian economy, which was reported by the World Bank or the IMF to have contracted from $476 billion in 2022 to $199 billion in 2024. Mr. Dangote turns 70 next year, and one would say, look, I've built the continent's largest refinery, I have successful operations across several industries, and I'm back in the top 100 list of the world's richest people. Let me take it easy. For him, this is not the case. He will not be taking it easy anytime soon. When I wrote this script, I actually went on to contrast his work ethic over the years to the decisions he is making today to keep moving forward. But I thought to reserve that for the section where we dissect what we learned from Mr. Dangote, so I shall save that for the end of the podcast. Currently, Dangote Group is working on a grand ambition, Vision 2030. The idea is simple. Scale our revenue to $100 billion a year. Behind that number is hundreds of thousands of jobs, tens of billions of dollars more in downstream industries being built, infrastructure developed, and new upstream industries that can exist as a result of his investments. The compounding effect of all this industrial activity will translate to the lives of millions of Africans being improved. To achieve this, Mr. Dangote will have his oil refinery increase production to 1.4 million barrels as mentioned, with the target finish date of 2028. He's also organizing to open a new refinery in East Africa. He will increase the production at the cement company from 52 million tons today to 66.4 million tons by 2030. He's also doubling or tripling down on the production of fertilizer, with plans to build a $4 billion complex in Ethiopia in partnership with the Ethiopian government, where they will hold a 40% stake through their sovereign wealth fund, and he will retain the remaining 60%. The complex will come with its own gas to electricity facility and a pipeline, in addition to the actual fertilizer production, making it potentially the largest facility in all of Africa. He calls Ethiopia a key strategic destination, considering they are the second largest recipient of investments from the Dangote Group in the continent. When I was researching this part, I got excited because of the positive reinforcement from the Ethiopian government, which has done extremely well in growing the economy over the past 2 decades. And with that, I'll be doing an episode on the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, who has been key to this development story soon. I can go on and on speaking about Africa's greatest industrialist, but I will end talk about Vision 2030 and the Dangote Group's plans, and now share more nuggets before we wrap this episode up. I will mention though that they are now taking the refinery public on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. However, he plans to allow more people across Africa to have access to the continent's most lucrative piece of industry. So there will be dual listings, potentially in Nairobi, Johannesburg, and London stock exchanges. I'm sharing this for those who want to share in this growth story by putting their money on him. By the way, this is not investment advice. Mr. Aliko Dangote has 3 daughters and an adopted son. The daughters are Fatima, Maria, and Halima Dangote. His eldest daughter, Mem Maria Dangote, has an MBA from Coventry University in the United Kingdom and makes up the board of Dangote Cement. Mem Halima Dangote, his second daughter, is the Group Executive Director of Dangote Industries Limited, or DIL, and is also deeply involved in the operations at Dangote Cement. Mem Fatima Dangote, his third daughter, is the Group Executive Director of the operations at DIL, meaning, among other things, she manages the commercial operations at the refinery in Lekki. Mr. Dangote also has a foundation, Aliko Dangote Foundation, which has $1.25 billion in endowments today. It would have been the largest foundation in Africa if it was not for the MasterCard Foundation, which takes first place with $40 billion in endowments. Now, I'd like to focus on the key takeaways and lessons from this titan in industry. Firstly, let's discuss his work ethic. As mentioned, though he is turning 70 soon, his habit of sleeping for 3 to 6 hours a day and pulling 14 to 18-hour workdays is not stopping anytime soon. He's Africa's greatest industrialist of the 21st century so far. And it's not that his work ethic is driven by his desire to be number one in Africa, but that his relentless efforts to industrialize our continent just came with the byproduct of building a $32 billion fortune along the way, which makes him come first. He did not start working this hard in 2020 or 2010. His visit to Brazil in the 1990s changed his way of thinking and led to him building Dangote Group as we know it today. That success is just a result of 30 years of successful compounding on a strong industrialization first strategy, which was made possible through his tough work ethic. Even then, He wouldn't have been able to do that if it was not for the 20 years of work he did as a major wholesaler in Nigeria, which he started in his early 20s. In other words, the Mr. Dangote we see today is a byproduct of 50 years of consistent hard work. So if you are a young person and you're inspired by him and you want to make your mark in an industry, you do not start at age 30 or 40. Otherwise, you'll already be 10 or 20 years behind. If you are already 50, even if you already have $10 million in the bank and you want to industrialize to the point of beating his net worth, you currently are 30 years behind. I say this because in the work he has done over the decades, he has accumulated connections, relationships, knowledge, and a trustworthy track record. It is because of his strong track record that a bank can give him a $6 billion loan and not you or me. That wealth in relationships enables him to attract the best talent on the continent and around the world to work for him. So if you want to play a major role in industrializing Africa, you have to be willing to push 80 to 100-hour work weeks and less holidays, maintaining a razor-sharp focus on elements that matter. Speaking of the elements that matter, leading on to the second thing, do not start with industrializing Africa as the objective. When he started his journey, he only had $3,000, 3 trucks, and a trading career. Trading goods was what opened the door of business to him and enabled him to build the wealth that allowed him to invest into building factories. You need to find out what you will do to take you from 0 to 1 in the world of business and from $1 to $100 million in wealth. At that scale, you can begin to make bets in the manufacturing space that actually changes entire countries. Now, as a young person, you have one major advantage today that Mr. Dangote didn't have during his time. You live in a world of the internet and now artificial intelligence. AI has reduced the barriers of entry to anyone who is willing to build a product, and the internet has reduced the barriers of entry to people who want to distribute products. Learn how to use these tools for what they really are. They can have a multiplier effect on your productivity. The third thing we'll discuss is Mr. Aliko Dangote's consistent bet on Africa. When we go back to the iconic visit he made to Brazil in 1997, he had a major realization. If Brazil had much worse structural problems than Nigeria, and they still could build industry, as was the case back then corruption and bad governance is not an excuse for Africa not industrializing. So what then becomes our excuse? We are too scared. I'm able to put more than 10 hours of work a day to this work because I enjoy it. You should find an area of craft that you enjoy so much that you can do it for 12 to 14 hours a day and not need to think about cutting distractions because you enjoy what you're doing so much that your fulfillment from your work becomes a thing that cuts out the distractions. This is how you avoid doom scrolling for hours until the morning. And as a former doom scroller, I can tell you, doom scrolling is a byproduct of the lack of fulfillment. When you are so fulfilled with what you're doing in life and it's time to sleep, you get excited only because you're getting a few hours of shut-eye and you'll be able to get back to the thing you enjoy the most in life. And you take away all the distractions like doom scrolling till the morning, something I've done a lot. Here's a tip for those who want to see Africa industrialized but aren't interested in the industrial work itself. You have a big opportunity. You may not be an expert in petrochemicals, mining and agriculture, but there is something you're good at. And you're so good at that thing, if you put 80 hours of work into that space, it would make you a lot of money. That lot of money may not be $1 million. It may be $10,000 a year. Now, your job is to find a community of hardworking people or wealthier people, or build one, and work together to find brilliant people you can invest into that will either work very hard in a place of skill like you all do as a group, or invest into a person with a passion for industrialization. If a certain Mr. Sanusi Abdul Kadir did not give Mr. Aliko Dangote that loan and those trucks 50 years ago, he would not have had a story to tell, or it might have come out a lot differently. When you and 19 other hardworking people invest your combined cash into people doing something big and different, you find out that you could have the same power Mr. Sanusi Abdul Kadir had over Mr. Dangote's future. And you can now use that power to empower the next generation of builders. The next major thing we see from Mr. Dangote is a true love for Africa. People say they love Africa and in the same breath talk about getting work in Europe and in America and not coming back, and do not invest into the places they come from. And they only come back either for holiday or during election season to run for mayor or president. That is if they do not come back in a coffin. That does not work. To truly care for Africa is to commit wherever you are to acknowledge the difficulty of building in Africa and take them head on. Mr. Dangote had to and still has to contend with the government of Nigeria to get things done. The Nigerian government is the most powerful government on the continent, by the way. They run a nation of 240 million people, and no other country comes close. Not being in even terms with this institution is a terrible and expensive place to be in. Just ask Mr. Dangote, who paid $500 million in interest on debt that was for a refinery that ended up not being built. In 2026, there's no Olokola refinery. There could have been one. Nevertheless, the interest on the debt for that refinery is still gone. This just serves as a sign to people who think doing business in Africa is just about connections and having money, or people who think things get easy because there's more money. No, things only get harder when you make money. What changes is the nature of your problems. Today, things are difficult because we are working hard to put food on the table, send children to school, and have roofs above our heads. 10 years from now, when you have 400 people working for you and the only thing standing between your business and bankruptcy is 3 weeks of cash, you're not thinking about how grateful you are to send your child in the most expensive school in the country. You're stressing about how to keep food on the table for 400 families. That's 400 times the stress. To dial the pressure a notch, you are dealing with this difficulty in the most difficult continent to do business in. Now, this may sound like the warning shot that causes people to quit, but actually, you're supposed to look at the greener pastures. If entrepreneurs were afraid of building in Africa, we would not have the farms, schools, the internet, banking, fuel, cars, houses, infrastructure, and so on. With all of this, there are millions of jobs made and millions more several households that can have a middle class life. By choosing not to be afraid to bet on yourself or on the continent, you're effectively helping in building the continent's middle class. Speaking of green pastures and difficulty, you must understand that the biggest advantage of doing business in Africa is that doing business in Africa is hard. This sounds like a contradiction. Shouldn't doing business be easier? Well, think of it this way. If anyone can start a restaurant, and as you know, it's much easier to start a restaurant, many people will have restaurants. And as you know, there are many restaurants out there. What does this mean as a consumer? We have a lot of variety and great prices because of competition. What does that translate to for the restaurant owner? This means doing business is hostile. They do not have a permanent moat because someone can take their ideas and copy them. Many other restaurants are competing against them. So at times, you may be pushed or forced into a race to cut down prices, to have better prices than your competition at the expense of your margins. Now, let's look at another industry, car manufacturing. How many African-owned car manufacturers do we have? Not so many. If you become the person that deals with the automobile industry and the complexity thereof and keep fighting on, well, guess what? You could have for yourself a strong monopoly in the continent as Africa's sole producer. If you build a housing district with 32,000 units as a real estate project in a country or city that does not have a hotly contested real estate market on the continent, and you keep fighting on, you would have made for yourself $1 billion business. If you take this to agriculture, refining minerals, building technological products, and so on, you can see that the opportunity to build massive monopolies exists because the hardships of doing business in Africa serve as a filter to take out the people who are not tough enough to enter an industry. People complain about Mr. Aliko Dangote building monopolies. Mr. Dangote has a monopoly not because he colluded with the government and bankers to destroy his competition, but because he chose to invest into the markets the IMF, the World Bank, the rating agencies, and the fake or crooked news networks and the so-called experts in Africa told you not to invest into. And guess what? In the short to medium term, all these people are correct. But in the long term, another thing can be true. Africa's population will be 40% larger and the economy 3 times bigger. Regulation will improve slowly but gradually. Infrastructure will improve too. This means anyone who builds a $50 million company today and does the right things will become a billionaire because Africa is the right market to build in. You do not get those returns on investment in the United States, Europe, or China today, except if you are in a fancy industry like artificial intelligence. There, you build by disrupting the competition. Here, you have no competition to disrupt. Be like Mr. Aliko Dangote. The fourth thing, and this is a short one. At some point, Mr. Dangote wanted to buy Arsenal as a soccer team. Imagine how much pride that would have brought onto himself and the African continent for owning one of the world's most successful sporting franchises. But guess what? If he bought Arsenal, it would have taken 10 or 20% of the capital he should have allocated towards building Africa. If a billionaire has to forego luxuries to invest into what matters, you and I must learn how to put aside luxuries to build. The next and final lesson, which is a lesson on business. When Mr. Dangote entered an industry, he used the power of scale and backward integration to make operations easier. And think about this. When you are buying groceries for yourself, you have to pay the marked up costs of the retailer. When one retailer buys groceries to stock in their shop, they have to pay more for the same goods per unit than if one retail chain with 100 branches will pay for products, because businesses will give them a bulk discount. The bigger you are, the lower price you can negotiate for yourself. Furthermore, the larger you are, the more easily you can apply the power of backward integration to your business. Backward integration is when you build capacity in downstream industries to serve your own business's needs. For example, in our retail example earlier, people are going to be buying a lot of bread. So instead of you being a retailer that just takes bread from the major suppliers, you begin to bake the bread for your customers yourself. That's an example of backward integration. Another one, a factory needs electricity. Electricity is under the factory, so you can see it as a downstream industry. When you choose to begin to produce your own power, which is an easy example of backward integration, you reduce your dependence on the national grid. When you farm on 2,000 hectares of land instead of 2, you can build roads that connect you to the main highway. Now, if you only have 2 hectares, no matter how wonderful that land is, if you had to park your car at a distance and cut through tall grass and bushes for 10 minutes while you're walking to access your field, you will not meaningfully produce simply because you do not have a road. Backward integration can only be the most effective when you're operating at a larger scale. With that being said, scale is good and being big is good, not bad. Imagine if you can help 10 million people instead of 10 people with something good you did. Or imagine if out of the profits of your good business, you can donate to 10 million people instead of 10. Having skill enables you to help more people and not less. So do not let anyone else tell you that having a big business is bad. Mr. Aliko Dangote's story is one of hard work, strategy, and not giving up. These 3 laws apply to any discipline in life. That's why I said I would first introduce people to Mr. Dangote if I wanted to share with the world where my continent is going. With that being said, I thank you, my listeners, for listening. Keep pushing. I'm rooting for your success, and the world is waiting on your light to shine.